You can sit on my chair.
I'm going to still do a chair.
You go sit in the chair.
And we'll light everything. Okay. Good. Right. Let's move that over to here. Yes. We're going to behave. Yes. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the session to move over. Which it hasn't. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Hi. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this next We Move session. It's so delightful to be here with you tonight. If you've never come across We Move before, We Move is a series of seminars delivered by music and technology experts who just happen to be women and gender minority. And today we are talking with Laura Lee, who is going to be leading us through an exploration of guitar and Ableton and how those two marry in a beautiful sound designy way for both performance and production. In case you've never come across Laura Lee before, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. So she's an interdisciplinary creative practitioner, guitarist, composer and performer. Laura is a practice-based researcher as well, who combines popular musicology and arts-based practice research, exposing new approaches to music and technology, blurring the lines of studio and the stage. Excellent. Laura is also a guitarist in a band, Parachute for Gordo, okay, and has toured the UK and Europe with festivals like ArcTanGent and Portals within the math, post and experimental rock music scene. And she's also got a solo project coming up called Enid, which I'll ask her about at the end. She's also doing a PhD, which is dead cool, about post-rock composition and performance. And she lectures all over the place, really, but particularly at the University for Creative Arts, with whom we have an excellent relationship as well, because we've done our seminars there before and we love them. But also in Germany, in music composition and technology, audio design and computing, and the arts and creative industries management. Phew! Okay, and Laura is passionate about creative projects and collaborative projects and building multiple mentoring and outreach projects with Ableton, who have sponsored today's seminar alongside Isotope and Focusrite, who are awesome, and the UK music charity F4WT. Right, good, excellent. Okay, so so I'm now going to just hand over to Laura. Please come and take your hot seats.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction. Okay. That was a beautiful introduction. You've almost covered what I was going to cover in the first bit. So it's fine. It's fine. Just that sort of just giving you parameters of where I've come from. I work at the moment between two universities, the University of Creative Arts and also Berlin School of Popular Arts. I've also been sort of collaborating a lot with Ableton on multiple projects. That's sort of a little introduction of like sort of the people I'm working with. And as you said, just the introduction of those universities and the sort of PhD that I'm doing. That sort of like I've just designed like a beautiful research project that sort of encapsulates all my passions, and it means that I can get to talk to like really interesting people through it. And through the University of Creative Arts, I'm part of a sort of a collective called the Audio Research Cluster. And this is quite an interesting programming of research because we try and bring masterclasses, which also Ableton have been involved in, and we try and bring sort of like trying to mix between industry, great, fantastic artists, and also music research. So for one example, we had the artist Juliet Fox in, who's on drum code, and she did a masterclass for us on the Audio Research Cluster. Really trying to sort of push forward sort of bringing these worlds together, basically. And then, yes, my sort of partnership with Ableton was to sort of have this vision that in education that, we sort of need to sort of deal with the sort of issue of the gender gap that we have, So we did a scholarship, and this is an example of three years ago I set this up, and these students have actually just completed this week. But we're setting up a similar thing in Germany, just so I've sort of encouraged more certified trainers. And so that's a bit of an introduction. And then I'm in also this band called Parachute for Gordo. This has been going for 10 years now. And this will be sort of focal point in the middle part of this talk today, because it's definitely my main platform for defining my sort of guitar sound. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And through this sort of discography, this basically I treat my albums a bit like a big experiment, and I'm sort of going to share with you, like I tend to have like ridiculous large ideas, and get as many people I know who are talented and creative and get them involved in these projects. But it's I've always been sort of passionate about, especially when we're integrating technology, that you can almost have like it's almost like high arts thinking, but actually just make it very sort of giggable. So that's the idea behind it, which I'll talk about. And as Jenny introduced, I'm about to release this solo project, which was called Enid, which was mastered by one of the other We Move talkers, Katie. Yes. And and this project was a really ambitious project where, and again, I'll go a bit more in depth on this. Sorry, just lost. Oh, there we go. We're good. Where it was sort of I will go more into this, but basically the idea is to sort of like create. As a guitarist, I have all these pedals, and it's very easy to get excited about it. But I was wondering if you could apply the same sort of idea for a drummer, and it can make it very giggable. And I'll go more into depth about that project as well. And what's quite interesting about that project, so if you think about that, it was a really sort of large scale what's the word? Sort of production value to it, and which I'll explain. But people are really interested how people are recording music now, and the sort of revealing the process. So it can almost become like an art piece. There we go. So it was exhibited against like photographers, textile artists. So people are super interested in like not only the final production, but how like technologists, how musicians are actually creating their works. And I'm basically based mostly in Berlin, and I have a nice little studio. I also play drums and bass as well, but I'm predominantly known as a guitarist. And it's sort of a joke. My guitar style is very sort of like effect heavy and sort of almost like digital sounding. But my bass, I can play groovy bass lines. This was the joke of this particular project. So you can sort of, I like to play with groove as well. And in Berlin, I was asked to play CTM Festival. And I did sort of like this large, almost like orchestra of musicians playing sort of digitacs and samplers. And I was involved in that within the course I work for, Computer in the Arts, which was a beautiful experience. So all this sort of like interest with creative technology, the idea of the studio as an instrument is all sort of feeding into sort of like transmedia and all these sort of festivals as well. So this is the outline of my talk today. I'm just going to talk a bit high level on sort of like my motivations of why I think I do what I do. I don't know if it is, but I think this is why I do what I do. So to give you a bit of historical and cultural understanding of my practice. And then I'm going to talk about this sort of idea of the studio stage feedback loop, which is basically a response to playing in gigging environments, recording different studios environments, and then how that continuously feeds into your production values. So that'll be the second part. And then the final part is when I will just deconstruct, I think, my understanding of my pedal board and how over years I've sort of like built interest in signal flows, because it's interesting when I perform. I guess the main band I spoke about is almost like a experimental math rock band. So it plays with time signatures, arpeggiated styles, guitar playing. So I do all this sort of technical playing, but what always seems to have the most intrigue is the use of pedals and looping and all these sort of techniques. So I'm going to start with my motivations. Just going to have a little drink. Okay. Okay, cool. I'm just having a little drop of the screen. That's fine. So I got really inspired. I read this book called How to Steal Like an Artist, and it was talking about, and it's really like small, sort of almost like coffee table book, but basically it talks about if you take from one person, then you're stealing from them. But if you take from 10 people, then you become original again. And also when I read this book, I quite like this sort of diagram that Austin has between the analog and the digital. So you have this idea of like, maybe like when we're musicians now, when we're trying to mix production and our instruments, it gets quite confusing. Perhaps we need to almost make almost like a desk where you stick completely in the analog and then you switch over to digital, which is one way, because I find that sometimes you don't feel most creative when you're sort of checking your emails at the same time. But then we're not at a point where we feel like we can express ourselves purely with sort of analog means. So I find myself a lot in this space of trying to like just blend them so I could just have my creative idea between the both. And I'm always quite interested in this like deconstruction of binaries between the acoustic and electronic, the studio and stage, experimental and accessible, between the fixed and regular and improvisational and sort of digital and analog. And I sort of feel like I'm always just quite interested in trying to find this perfect medium between the two of them. And then I sometimes push myself. I'm like, fine, I'll just be completely acoustic. Maybe I don't need all this stuff. Maybe that'll be enough. Or sometimes I'm like, oh, screw having an amp. I'll just literally play through a pair of PAs. So I tend to sort of like push these binaries a lot to sort of like get my original voice through, I guess. And the idea of like really being pushed into really experimental environments where you're sort of like highly improvisational and you don't know what's going on, to actually playing groove oriented straight up pop and this sort of stuff. So I feel like I find myself continuously pushing myself between these, and that's how I sort of find my sort of this tension is what leads me to sort of like get excited about this sort of this work. So this is an example of me saying, like, I started this big project where I was like, okay, I'm just going to start with just acoustic guitar, but then I'm going to maybe just play an acoustic guitar with my sort of chords I normally know. That's not enough. So then I start to, so let's get it back up. Then I start to, I'll do an open tune in. So I'll change the tune in. Maybe that'll be more exciting. Oh, then I'll play it like lap style. So I'll do like harmonic slaps and things like that. And I'll just try and do something innovative outside this restriction. And then I slowly start building up from there. And then this is an example. I was like, oh, maybe just recording in normal studios is not enough. So maybe I'll go to Austria because my friend has an abandoned building, and maybe that would be more inspiring to do that. So I'll take all my pedals on a plane, and I'll just go to this abandoned building. We'll set up a mobile rig, and I'll talk about this project later on, because I think, okay, that might enable me to sort of like respond to spaces and things like that. And then on a recent project, I went to Brighton, to the studio Brighton Electric, and I worked with producer Mark Roberts, and then I was like, oh, maybe I do want that big fat sound, so maybe I'll play out of 2 large cabs, and I'll think about stereo field, and I'll do this with my guitar. So then there's always this like, as well, this sort of tension between immediacy and DIY values, and then with this idea of like high production. Yeah, so that was that. And then obviously, then sometimes I'm like, well, if I want this high production value, then maybe I can just, why can't this be articulated on stage? Why does it have to be, as soon as I start integrating like Ableton, why does it have to be less performative? Why are we sitting at laptops with just, just being submissive or just inside ourselves? Why can't we make it really explorative and explosive? with this style of performance. So this recent project, Enid, that I was talking about, I did the same restriction. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to start with just amplifying maybe just my acoustic and electric guitar with no pedals. That's fine. And then I was like, oh, okay, no, okay, fine. I'll put like a stereo field with this. So I'll have like, okay, stereo out, and I'll go out of 2 amps. Okay, no, I will go through my pedals. So then I'm like, okay, let's put that through that rig. And I do like quite a lot of delays, as you'll see, and I like digital delays that double up as loopers. So I was like, okay, cool, no, that's fine. Oh no, but maybe then I will actually go through Ableton Live, and I'll build like a sampler of my guitar playing, which I can then also loop and trigger. But then I do want it to sort of sound like a guitar, so I'm going to re-amp that. And but then also I want bass frequencies, like production values, so then I'll go out of 3 amps, and then this bass amp was taking the sort of like bass frequencies. And then also I want to be able to trigger my own playing, so I use a MIDI foot switch at the same time. So yes, so that was that project, and then it ended up looking like this. Yeah, so this was the idea of sort of having this sort of like, imagine sort of like, so I was reading about the production of like My Bloody Valentine, and sort of thinking about layering sort of 20 guitars on top of each other. But I'm like, oh, why can't you do it in real time? Why can't we almost get that wall of sound? Yeah. And then actually, then I was like, okay, I quite like this approach I do on my guitar. So why can't we do it on drums also? So maybe then I'll put like affected microphones on different parts of the kit, and then that will be also put through Ableton Live. So why can't I get like a floor tom sounding like, you know, like a, I don't know, sort of a part of an 808 kit and things like that. So it was almost like trying to be excited about manipulation of like acoustic drums as well. And I thought, well, maybe you can also do that to a piano as well. So maybe I'll sort of apply this sort of re-amping analogy to the piano as well. So yeah, I tend to do this quite a lot. I'm sort of like, okay, I'll try and restrict myself, and then so I did that. So I was like, okay, I'm going to make this project where I'll expand out from guitar, and I'll have the same analogy, and I'll put it through drums and also piano. So it's almost like I'm building sort of like studio instruments that could be played live. Okay, yeah, and then I'm going to put that all through this sort of audience desk here, and this is all going to be rigged through Ableton at the same time. So I'm having a few screen issues. I don't know, shall we, Jenny, do you want to intervene?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
Check.
what's happening.
It might just be the connection of the
maybe.
HDMI.
Sit tight, folks.
Sit
tight. Let's just check what we've got going on.
So I just think maybe it was just a loose on the,
Yeah. Okay.
but it seems like, okay, if I,
Let's do that one, and then this one is.
I think if I keep on the mouse, I think it's okay, but it just seems
It
that,
might just be a bit of a headache though for you for the whole thing.
that's
Okay,
it.
well, everything's secure.
Let's try it. Let's try that.
All right.
Thank you for that.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Yeah, so then I was like, okay, so I'm going to get all these expansive instruments, and then I'm going to put them through a desk, and I'm going to work with an engineer so you can do live mix and response. And this is what I'll talk about a little bit more later. But then you go through all this effort, and then it ends up just down to a sort of 8-track, which I actually just exported down into a stereo. So all this work expands out just to a plain. So this particular project was 4 years of work, and it's just down to a stereo tape. So yeah, I'm always interested in the role of the music studio. So I'm like, people just think, okay, you can have one aspect where it's just the idea of capturing a one single event. or the group performance. That's one idea of what the studio is involved. So a recording can either create something that isn't possible to do live, or it can document something that is live. So you might think, okay, we want to capture something that's beyond the live through multi-channels, digital and analog techniques. We want to highly automate it, do loads of editing in it. But I'm always thinking like maybe there could be something in between these worlds. I started doing a bit of research around it, and Brian Eno writes this article called "The Studio as a Compositional Tool," and talks about like you sort of like work directly with sound when you're sort of with a mixer, and you sort of like you can be almost like a painter where you're just working directly with these sound sources, and you can chop and change them, add pieces and things. So I'm like, oh yeah, maybe you can sort of approach guitar like that. Maybe I don't have to like stick to the rules. Maybe I can chop and change my sound all the time. But then when you're working with the studio, you're sort of thinking like, okay, this means lots of restrictions, playing with clicks. I have to take my absolute best take of everything. But then I think, screw it. So this is an example of a gig I did where I'm getting better now, but this is my first ever live drum experience with live response from an artist. And I'm like, why can't you have this energy and freedom in the recording and studio process? But then I'm like, oh no, but then the studio does give you all this sort of possibilities. And like this particular studio, which is part of UCA, it's got this, you know, beautiful outboard gear, and we have like Neve preamps, and I'm like, oh, that would be cool. So I'm always got this sort of tension in my playing. And then I started to read about David Byrne, How Music Works, and I thought this was really cool book in the sense of he talks about artists responding to different spaces, because I've always been as well sort of not quite happy, quite just completely satisfied with the sort of like traditional live dry studio space. I'm like, I want to respond and get excited about where I'm recording. So he talks about the idea of like how rock musicians particularly sound perhaps great in a room like this with low ceilings, and we sort of like play to the rooms that we play in. So you have a room like this, which I've been in many quite like this, and then, but I haven't quite played in a space like this, but perhaps guitar music and sort of like doesn't sound brilliant in spaces like this because it's not designed like this. Maybe if you had a band, like he said about Talking Heads, if you had Talking Heads there, it sort of gets sort of swallowed up in the sort of sound. But this is the important aspect of being a guitarist, is this sort of idea of that it's not just the playing, it's about every room you're in responding to the different, you know, frequencies, the different reverberance of the room, and this trying to respond to this sort of spaces. So I think it's weird that we sort of like end up using our sounds in the sort of spaces we play out in. So then I started to think about, when I was reading David Byrne's book, I got into this track and I was like, this is amazing guitar solo. I'm just going to play you a little bit of it.
Take a look at these hands. Take a look at these hands. I don't have to mention it. No thanks. I'm a government man.
That's pretty studio heavy manipulated guitar solo there, but it's still quite, you know, expressive and things like that. So yes, that was Talking Heads. So then I started to look at so the guitarist Johnny Greenwood, and then I was sort of quite interested in this idea of so the guitarist of Radiohead, and I was interested in this idea of he said this quote about the distinction between sort of like acoustic, authentic guitar playing and sort of this idea of guitar getting recorded. And he said a voice into a microphone, onto a tape, onto a CD, and through your speakers is all as illusionary and as fake as a synthesizer. but one is perceived as real and one is somehow unreal. It's the same between a guitar versus sampler. It's just it's free to disregard the notion of acoustic sounds being truer. So I'm like, oh, it's quite good to sort of blend between these worlds. So yeah, there's this sort of like history of this guitar sounds being truer and authentic. If it's, I mean, obviously I'm like playing for a Fender Reverb amp today, and this is from the 1950s, and obviously in my ear, I think that's what sounds original to me. But there's this disregarding notion where I could just play through these speakers and it would be the absolutely same. Yes. And then I started to look a bit of Johnny Greenwood's playing as a guitarist, and I quite like this idea of going slightly beyond the score. So this is just a score from Go to Sleep, and he, I just quite like, I'm just going to play you a little bit, and you're going to see how it slightly goes beyond the score here. You can hear there's sort of like these sort of effects that he's using. They're sort of like heavy with modulation, sort of like almost these sort of extended techniques on his guitar, and using Max MSP at the time is going a bit slightly beyond the score. In 2003, he talks about like he didn't want to just pick up a guitar and write chord sequences. We didn't even want to sit in front of computers either. We just wanted this third thing, which involved playing and programming. So I think like guitarists are in a point of where they want to have this sort of hybrid approach to their guitars. Like, why can't we use sequencers? Why can't we use samplers as well as our guitars at the same time? This sort of create this space where we're sort of not just automating in our laptops, where we're not just playing our guitar driven through chord sequences. We're like somewhere else. And then people, when in the band I'm in, kept saying, "You playing a post-rock band, Laura?" I was like, okay, cool. And then Simon Reynolds is I guess he's like a music journalist, which has a bit of like a cultural critical lens, I guess, on what he writes. But he's written about hip hop, he's written about rock music and gender, he's written about loads of different music genres. But he also wrote a little bit about post-rock, and he was saying about this idea of what happened to post-rock is that the soul is slightly, it's not abolished, but slightly decentered. So when we think of the history of rock music, we think like a sort of like virtuosic single guitar player expressing their soul, where I feel like post-rock is slightly decentered, and we're slightly influenced by club music like house, techno and jungle, where it's less about communication and more about the programming of sensations. So the sort of vehicle of our guitars are not as derived in storytelling. They're not vocally led. They're more about this idea of programming of sensations. I was like, yeah, I think so. I want to use my guitar in a different way. And then you can see this also in the Kid A in 2000. And this sort of this is an album that sort of turns sort of rock music. So you can sort of see it evident in this track. And it's sort of like that came out, and you think like, where are the guitars? It's predominantly focused on the sort of the drum machine. How is that working in a band context? They heard Kid A and they're like, how would they even play that live in 2000? And then I started reading more about the impact on sort of radio's work. And then there's this guy called Brad Osborne who talks a lot about guitarists using timbre as more of an idea of exploration of their sort of musicality, more away from harmony and more away from playing with normal popular music forms. But Brad Osborne talked about, which I quite like, this idea of the Spears-Stockhausen continuum. So you've got like Britney Spears on one end of it, and you've got Stockhausen, the experimental German composer, on the other. And he argues that Radiohead are an example of a band who sort of go from both of these ends of the spectrum. So I think it's just quite interesting. It's like I'm always trying to think, what would be the perfect balance? Why can't I borrow from like experimental guitarists and again popular guitarists and be somewhere in the middle? So Simon Reynolds talks about like post-rock guitarists tend to use their guitars more as timbre and texture, less than power chords. Yeah, I rarely play power chords, but I do sometimes. In the sort of like, actually just having a chat with Jenny before this, how to use our guitars, and it's almost like sometimes I end up using higher on the neck because to not sort of always be in the mid range and not let the sort of guitar sort of dominate through use of power chords. So that's one thing that he identified. Also this idea of using digital technology and samplers and sequence in your setup. And also this idea of like DJ culture fundamentally infecting rock music. So I do think that, I think it's, when we think about DJ culture, it's almost like the transitions are more impressive than the actual tracks themselves. People are always really intrigued by like, how did you like mix or cue or bring in that track one to another? And I think this is what happens with the idea of like guitar loop and things like that. It's almost like how you bringing in these other elements to your guitar playing. So that's what I think has fundamentally changed through the impact of DJ culture. So when they said to me, like, people like, oh, you're in this post-rock band, and then I was like, oh, okay, so this is from a site called Every Noise. You can type in any band and then it will come up with bands that seem to fit into your genre. So when I put in post-rock, it put a lot of bands that people might have heard when you talk about this genre, a lot of like Sugar Ross, Explosions in the Sky, Boredom are quite cool, the Japanese band, and So I Watch You From Afar, which I've actually played with. So these are sort of like the go-to sort of characteristics of some of the post-rock bands. But actually when I researched it more, it was the idea of, they were talking about post-rock sounds with the release of this album in '67, and it was just basically they were talking about George Martin being, who produced this album, as a fifth member of the band, and this album would not be actualized without the idea of the role of the engineer of that album. So that's what I think probably post-rock sound is more. It's just more of enabling our guitar to be set up like a studio and like an instrument in its own right. And when I started talking to other guitarists around this subject, there's one guitarist, Matthew Collins, and he said, talking about the idea of Jimi Hendrix, and saying like Jimi Hendrix was a virtuoso, but he played with the speakers as much as he played the guitar. So there was a change of focus of what people expect from guitarists. It's almost and I still to this day don't think there's like such a performative guitar player as Jimi Hendrix, but the idea of using feedback and this performative aspect was part of Jimi Hendrix's playing. And this is Jeff Mills, who I'm a fan of, and there's this person called Mark Butler, who's a professor actually in Berlin, who wrote this book about the Berlin scene and techno and house. And when I read this, they were saying like, so if we're going to be a guitarist that are using pedals and sequencers, it's almost like the more we use technology, the stronger need for a performativity. So I feel that when we're being a guitarist and you want to use pedals and you want to use this, that you want to almost display even more performative aspects of this involvement. As people get sort of fatigued with sort of laptop performance, we want to push it somewhere else. Then I started talking to other musicians like Adam Betts, who is a drummer from the Heritage Orchestra, and he plays for Goldie and Square Pusher. He also plays in a band called Free Trap Tigers. And I was talking about this idea of where he thinks his instrument is. He has a very hybrid approach to his drums, and he said that he almost feels naked without the electronics. He feels like he can't articulate what he wants without the hybrid approach to his instrument. And it's interesting talking to drummers as a verse to guitarist. You're like, okay, it's just like a fundamental aspect of your sound. But obviously manipulating drums, unlike pedals for a guitarist, is much more tricky. Then I spoke to Stella from the band Warpaint, who uses like the Roland pad, the SPDX. That's it. And then you can sort of launch samples. And she said that for that particular band, she also plays for the XX sometimes. The production value becomes a fundamental part of the playability, and having sort of this integrated approach is really important. And one of the key guitarists who sort of explores Ableton and his sound is Ian Willems, who's in the band called Battles. And I spoke to him also. He's also in a band, was in a band called Don Caballero, who are a big influence. But he has quite an interesting guitar setup where he plays out of bass amps. All his Ableton live set goes through this, and he sort of does like uses the neck of the guitar tap techniques so he can actually play keyboards and set samplers off at the same time. So that's a sort of bit of the context of why I think I'm doing what I'm doing. Now I'm going to give you a bit of context from the sort of the band I'm in, and how I feel like there's this sort of feedback loop between the studio and stage, and what I think is happening. So I've used every album I've done as a big experiment to sort of push with all those sort of conceptual boundaries I was talking about before. So I'm just going to sort of go into that. So if you talk about, like, I hear stuff on the radio or I hear some extremes and I'm like, that sounds amazing. So like, I'm a massive Burial fan, and I'm like, how can I make my guitar sound like Burial? Why can't I have that sort of emphasis in my instrument? And then you're like, oh, I can maybe achieve that in the studio environment. But how can then I perform that live? So this translation from something that just comes from my head that I hear, and then something I try and articulate in the studio, and then I try and easily translate that live, and then I just keep feeding back this. And this is almost how my pedalboard has developed over time. Is almost like, oh, I think that would sound amazing. And like today I'll show, like, I was like, I love Bjork, so she does a lot of glitch work. That would be amazing if my guitars could do it. Oh, I can do it in the studio, but I don't have a pedal that does it. So I'm like, oh, maybe I can try and integrate a pedal so I do it in live performance. And it's sort of like this continuous loop of what I'm doing. So sorry, here we go. Screen's okay. Yeah. I'm trying to just stay here, so I'm just, here we go.
You're doing great.
I'm just so yes, so let me give you a bit of, so this band's been going for 10 years, and I feel like basically my board has expanded through this band, and I'm going to explain why and the ambitions I had within this band and how this has affected the sort of use I do. So I started my first recording called 8 Minutes of Weightlessness. That was done in a rehearsal room, and we DIY'd record it in that space, and it was just 5 tracks. And we always had this sort of ambition as a band to only capture it as soon as we literally could play it. Like, don't worry about perfection, just make it immediate, just record it as soon as it was possible. And then we had this, 2 years later, we had this opportunity to actually put it to, oh, sorry, 1 second. Wait a second, here we go. I'll come to that. I was 2 slides later. So I had this, so this was actually being able to be put onto vinyl, and we had like a beautiful red vinyl. And I was like, okay, so let's be really ambitious with this album. We're still going to do it ourselves. We're still going to keep it raw in one take in a room. And one side was, so the 2 sides are 22 minutes long on a vinyl, but we're going to do one track that's 15 minutes long, and we're going to do it in one take as well. And I'm really influenced by all these sort of bands, like I was saying, like sort of like I really so Bjork's Hyper Ballad. I love the sound of the hand clap. in that. And I was like, what, could I do that in my instrument? So I'm just going to play you a small example of a bit. Okay, here we go. Smaller example of a bit where we actually, I use a lot of effects on my guitar, and then we actually put a cymbal on the drums to make it sound like a sort of 808 hand clap. So this is it. That was just captured in a rehearsal room. So I'm like, cool, that sounds like sometimes sounding a bit like what I want sort of from electronic music, but just played in our instruments. And this was the start of me starting to use some pedal use. So I just had like a line 6 MIDI foot switch, started using live, and then I just had a small amount of pedals there. You can see I've just got like an EQ, a chorus, a delay pedal, and a tuner. That's all I had at the time. But I was like, oh, maybe I could play like hand claps with my MIDI foot switch, and I can set samples off. And this is the rehearsal room it was recorded in, and I played out of on Orange, and also the Fender Reverb Deluxe I have. And in these environments, obviously, you're compromising. At the time, we had like a engineer for this one who had a mobile rig in 2014, and you think, oh, that's quite normal now. But at the time, it was quite hard to just get like out of the studio recordings. And we did it in that space. And you hear these stories all the time, like a nice little happy accident as I left the tremolo on the Orange, and then it was in stereo, but we kept it. And all these sort of happy accidents that happen in the studio, then you're like, well, maybe that would actually sound quite cool live. And that was the first recording we had. And then it was on, this is what I was trying to find a second ago, the Pretty Vinyl. And we worked with this artist who does live response. She sees a lot of blue in our music, and her name is Karina. So that was like, so you're like, cool, okay, we're a proper band now. So we've got actual records now. And then I got pretty ambitious with this one. It was like, okay, so I'm going to do another vinyl release, but I want to do a lot more with Ableton. So I started to use scenes to trigger sections, and I wanted it to have a live. We did a music video for every track, and then we did a live album launch where we did live visuals. And we also recorded it in the middle of nowhere in Austria. And this got covered up in Music Tech magazine on this particular project. And I'll just play you a little clip of this. So you can sort of hear that sort of production value coming out in the guitar work there. So I'm sort of triggering scenes and sections for that album. And I'm just going to play like 2 minutes of a video to give you an idea of the recording process of this record. Hopefully it'll play.
We have been recording our album, possibility if not our third record.
Oh, why not inviting Paratrooper Gordo to this location, in this old house, to do the third album?
We approach things from a DIY angle, but we record things in 3 hours. So that last 2 records done in 3 hours.
I think it's something that's just quite personal.
Sorry, here we go. Let's try and get back.
We wanted to take longer, and we wanted to do it in a space where we weren't necessarily bothered by reality creeping in at the sides. So we didn't want to be at home, going home after a session. We wanted to be in the environment.
Actually, I thought this is a really good place for this band, because it's has a very special vibe.
I think, I respect quite a lot of as the word indie band, self-producing bands, because I feel they're trying to speak out, they're trying to talk to their scene, they're trying to connect with actual audiences.
I think there's a romance to taking over an environment and making it custom for you and get what you need out of it. It doesn't have to be a special studio, I don't think. I think it just has to be a space that you connect with, I would say.
Basically, we've got access to the amazing, like, from our films that are now being produced, which I respect, have just been from an iPhone, artistically driven, and these tools are within our hands. So why would we not try and use our imagination and do something creative with that?
Maybe this wild space here gave the band more opportunity to be themselves, to not to worry about like style and genre. They just did it and nailed it.
A little bit of an idea of that recording session. So we had to. We didn't have our own equipment, so we had to hire it all in Austria. They had to drive to the top of a mountain. There was quite a drunk lorry driver who gave it to me, but we had all the instruments there. There we go. Are we doing okay?
We are, yeah. We're not sure why the HDMI feed is cutting out. Is it possibly your computer's settings for going to sleep?
But that would be because I normally present from this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's.
We're not sure why, but for the moment, we're managing it okay.
I think so. Okay, cool. So I'll just keep wiggling. That's what I. Keep wiggling. That's fine. So then I did a project called Acoustic, and then I was going back through like, okay, I've done this high production album where I've done all these, did a live sort of visual album, lots of genres, using Ableton, much more integrated. Okay, I'm just going to do an acoustic guitar. So then I just did it in my house with a guy here, James, as an engineer. He did a PhD about how musicians respond to spaces. And then we did a lot of recording there. So then I did an album, which he then recorded the spaces from outside. And interesting, like obviously we feel mostly happy when we're at home, and a lot of like, if we think of the idea of bedroom recordings, that's probably when we feel the most vulnerable and happy to record. So I'm like always sort of interested, like everyone normally gets sort of red light syndrome when they're recording, so I'm like, oh, how could you get this sort of intimacy in recording? And then this takes me up to the most, like almost one of the most recent recordings, and we just released this just before COVID, so we played like a couple of gigs and released this. This album had like high production value, where we, as I said, we worked at Brighton Electric with Mark Roberts, and and then this was again working. This is the first time in the journey of the band that we actually were in a proper recording studio, because we always wanted that sort of flexible control ourselves, and we expanded out for this one. And I should have a short example of this. And this is the image I showed earlier, working in Brighton Electric. And it was the first time we did, everything was self-contained in this band, and we did all the recordings ourselves. And Mark Roberts was the first person I worked with. And I said, I'm just giving you my sort of creative baby here. Can you help my guitars almost sound like this? So I was like, wanted the ears to be beautifully in stereo field. So here's a sort of short example from this album. beginning parts. So then I was like starting to now use like the DL4, the DD7 to do lots of live looping. I do a lot of integration with samplers in this album. So it definitely felt like my ambitions then were serving well with the expansion of these sort of styles of studios. And then at the peak of COVID, no one could play live anymore. So we decided to do the thing called What Passes for Live Anyway. So I've gone from this album of really high production value into this idea of like, maybe we'll just try and record remotely at home. And then, so this is the Berlin studio. I was in Berlin with the drummer Mark, but then we had our bass player in Aldershot, in Hampshire, in the garden. And then we did a little live recording like this. Hopefully this will work. Interesting is like these are none of my pedals because I was stuck. I've just moved there. I had none of my own equipment. This is not my guitar. It's just all going through a sound card. And then I was like, oh, maybe it sounds the same. Maybe all this beautiful equipment doesn't make me sound like this. Maybe it can be achieved just from my laptop with sort of DIY equipment. So we released that. So this leads to this sort of final project that I've been working on called Enid, which is this sort of solo project. So I've gone through this 10 years expansive response to my guitar through the band. And then I sort of had this idea for, what about if I could have the production value on my instrument and we could capture this simultaneously? So no multi-tracking, nothing. We can just do it all in one space and time. So this is what I sort of started the talk a bit about, where I had that live expansive setup with my guitar through multiple amps and Ableton rig. And then we had affected mics on the kick, snare and the two toms. And this was allowed the drummer to select scenes and switch kits just like you would switch your pedals. We did experiment with like follow action with Ableton and also this idea of selecting scenes in clicks, but we decided actually to make it much more intuitive, we're going to sort of do it like they're actual instruments and we're just going to play. And it was mostly improvised as well. And what was the interesting part of this project is we brought in, this is James, and the album was captured with live mixing automation of the faders. So whatever James dialed in that one recording session was so he almost had to respond to our mixes, and he played that out. He's just got a little clip of him talking.
Okay, yeah, so
Capture.
The way Ableton is set up on the screen, we've kind of went for the sort of, we found the perfect solution of capturing like you would traditionally. So each of these different colored tracks would be a bounced version of each of these faders. So if we want to, we could do post-production. But what we've also got is this red track, which is actually the final output of the desk, meaning that when I pull a fader down or add some extra reverb, that's actually being written to the final track. So the live automation, again, like I said, automation is something you normally do in post with the effects and the plugins in the program. But in this case, every decision I make is definitive, which is not something that's traditionally done. Normally post-production gives you a lot of flexibility, but in this case you have to be quite decisive. So Yeah, all the automation is done entirely in real time, and after several rehearsals, I think I got to the best point where I kind of knew what was best for the sound. So yeah, EQ, volume, and effects are all baked into the final track, and in tandem to that, to add an extra little bit of pressure, they're also going into the tape machine. So we're getting a digital copy of the final output. We're also getting an analog copy of the final output, which again, this is something that you would press your final release to after post-production. So the fact that we're going through it and then you can immediately hear the album like it's the end of the studio process straight away is pretty crazy. So that was the aim. Oh.
Yeah, so you get the idea that, so what happened is we did this recording of this album in a theatre space, which was then rigged into a studio. We had cameras for each other so we could see and respond to each other. And then the studio audience like came up and heard the album instantly back, and that was the commitment. So that was, as I said, 4 years of work of building up to that concept of this sort of live studio experience of like producing something instantly to a final album. So this is what I've thought about. It was almost like, so normally when you're recording albums, you have this period of time where you sort of like work in a DAW or you work with your instrument. Then when you feel ready enough, you might do single and multi-tracking, and then you might then arrange in post through arrangements and overdubs and sort of like mixing, revised versions. But in this album, I wanted to build these hybrid instruments that were, and also all the mixing was done in real time, and this was done in one take to a stereo mix out, and then this was mastered by Katie. So that was my post-production, just a mastering. But everything just was done in a single take, but it sounded like the production of an album. I'll just show a short clip of this. And also there's some beautiful mistakes. There's just, you'll hear my guitar mistake, but I had to commit to the concept of the album. Anything that happened had to happen. Interesting because I didn't actually give James the engineer like very specific instructions. I just gave him I want you to respond and be like a musician, and he is a musician in his own right, so almost treating the mixing desk as an instrument in its own right. And what Avery did was the final thing for the final recording of the album. So that's the project Enid that will come out soon. So my final part of the talk today is I'm just going to talk about my pedalboard. Yeah, so this is what I'm going to just go to now, which won't be slide driven. So this is cool. I'm just going to start with the sort of idea of how I started to approach guitar. And my first ever pedal was a distortion pedal, which most people do start with. I've got a beautiful Fender amp here, so I've just got a bit of spring reverb as just default. So usually when you start with a guitar, you might have a distortion pedal. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to start playing around with this. And I'm like, oh, okay, it sounds all right, but maybe it's a bit sort of like, I've never been into sort of like loads of distortion, but I do like the sort of drive. And I'm using a Rat distortion pedal. So what I tend to do is have the distortion pretty low, and I actually had this modified, so it's actually less gnarly than it normally is. And I tend to like just put the distortion down, the volume up. So you almost just got like almost like so I'm like, okay, so that's usually my only distortion pedal that I use. And then I think one of my next pedals was just like a delay pedal. So I was like, oh, okay, cool. So you just start playing around. Since this is a DD7 Boss D. So most of my pedals are actually just Boss. So I don't have like super fancy boutique pedals. So then I just start playing around with the delay. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, okay, I'm starting to feel a little bit more like me now, a little bit more spatial guitar work. So, but then obviously some of these digital delay pedals, you've got like reverse, and you're like, okay, that sounds quite cool. Let's have a little play with that. And like when I was talking about like Sgt. Pepper earlier, you're thinking, okay, this is, so I've got like almost like studio effect reverse on my pedal. This sounds great. I'm into this. So maybe I'll try and like capture that. Going into a bit of a sort of maze of like, so there I was just stacking up some delay, then I looped the reverse delay, and then I just added reverb. So you're like, okay, so then actually maybe guitar playing is quite a lot of sound design, and I'm purposely just playing one chord today to show you how much you can get of one chord. And I've just started with my guitar in drop D, so that's sometimes what people start with. You're like, okay, I'm going to play the guitar and I'm going to play drop D. But then I tend to do a lot of things where I'm like, so what I tend to do as a guitarist, I was like, okay, I quite like some of these delays and reverbs, but maybe I'll start playing around with different tunings. So at the moment I'm tuned to, we have like D, A, D, G, B, E, so pretty much standard but dropped. And then I was like, okay, maybe I'll start playing around with different tunings. So I'm just going to tell you my tunings of my recent records. So I've got like, I'm going to drop down to a D, an A, a C sharp, and then I go down to an E. And then I go down to an A. and then I go down to a D. So I've done a lot of different open tunings. This is just one I got into in the last record. So I'm just going to check my tuning. Obviously, some guitarists play around with like baritones, especially when you're doing this sort of drop tunings. I tend to just think, oh, it's fine. I'll just have standard regular strings. It's okay. It can handle it. So now it should be. It's tuning now. So I'm like, okay, cool. Now I'm trying to experiment with different tunings. I'm going to go through that same idea of the effects. Maybe I'm going to use a modulated delay now. So I'm just going to go back to this now, see how this sounds. So that's just me playing around with a modulated delay. But then I started getting into pedals like another digital delay one, this Canyon. But I quite like this effect. This gets you almost like a stutter effect. So you get it like grabbing, which is quite fun. The DL4, which is quite a famous digital delay pedal, which is a looper, and I just grabbed that with that sort of stutter effect, and then with a delay as well, so I can bring it back. How your guitar's now sounding a little bit more in the electronic world. So imagine some of that reverberant guitar playing and then going through. So that's the main sort of pedals I started with.
The master volume is a little bit loud in the hall.
Yeah, that's all right. Okay. You're good. And then the only other sort of interesting pedals that I've got beyond just sort of delays and reverbs, I've got a Terra Echo. This gets quite interesting sounds. So you just get like this sort of tail underneath. If I turn it up quite a lot, you'll hear the difference. Maybe a bit overkill. Terra Echo, and another pedal that got quite through like bands like Battles. You've got like a Pog pedal here. So you get to get all that sort of fun stuff, sound a little bit less like the guitar traditions and rocks, probably more in this sort of post-rock sound that we're talking about. But then I started to think, okay, I want to start using Ableton within my guitar rig. So as well as these sort of main effects pedals, I have a Focusrite sound card. I have a line selector. And in this, I have my Ableton live set. So if I go into that. How are we doing for time? I was like...
We're good.
Good. Okay, good. Okay, so just to finish off today, we'll just look a bit at my live set, which I've really streamlined down for today. It's been years of messing around with Ableton, so I've tried to keep it really stripped to make it sort of understandable for today. So I've got a set on my guitar at the moment. I've just got two just for live effects. So I was getting to a point where I was like, oh, I can't get the pedals effects I want unless I'm sort of making them myself. And these are massively influenced by the studio, but they're not in pedal form yet. So I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe, so if I bring in, so on my channel, I have a send and return of A, which is going through the sound card. And then we should have, if I press, I've got two different effects. You can see change in here in the sort of chain selector. I just have the echo in one. So if I click here, we should get the echo. So I'm just playing with the echo here. If I play it right. So that's just the echo. But then if I want glitch guitar, I just press here, and then I should go. But yeah, if I take you to the patch, I'll just turn it up for 1 sec. So you should see my glitch patch. So a friend of mine helped me integrate this. You can turn the wet and dry of this. If I put a lot of glitch up, you should be able to. So you can hear all that sort of stuff going on. So you're like, oh, that sounds really interesting. But maybe I'll put it with effects. So I just play around with those two effects, so you can have between those two. So that's going back to the Ableton. Effect with that. So sometimes I just use it as a sort of literally audio effects channel, so you can start using sort of max patches and also just Ableton effects. But then I started using like the sampler and things. So then I was like, oh, I'll just sample myself playing. So this is literally just me strumming a guitar and then I'm sampling it. But then it should sound something like, so if I press this one, so we'll just turn it up a little bit. Okay, so you should hear my guitar now. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. It doesn't really sound like a guitar anymore. It sounds some like cool pad stuff. So if I just turn my guitar down for 1 sec. So just turn this up. So we've got. But within this, I've got some macro effects, and I've just put those up. That's just me playing with an auto filter, but I've also got like a ring modulator. If I want to. And I've just got the echo as well in this. But again, I could put this through the pedals if I want. So back to like that effect I had earlier. More reverb. And then I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I'll loop myself now. So I'm like, bit of reverb off. Let's craft the sound. More reverb here, maybe. then it's starting to sound a little bit more like what I'm hearing in the beautiful electronic production that I like. And then, yeah, so I've also got like, as well, so I've got different types of keys. You heard I do one song where I've got like some kicks as well as keys. So sometimes I have both set up, so I can have some hits as well. So if we go into that one. Here we go. So you can see I've got some 808 kicks and stuff in it. So I can sample this stuff. So as I'm playing, I can have this all going through my amp, and then I can loop the keys. So if I bring that back, and then I can play my guitar over the top and things like that, layer up multiple layers. And the only other fun thing I do, I tend to do like guitar audio effects, use samplers to sample myself. Like I've got an example, if I go out of this. One of the samples is in my studio. I have this like, you see, it's funny, I have all this stuff in my studio, and then I just have this 4-pound organ I got at like a flea market in Preston when I lived there, and everyone was always like, that sounds great, and it just sounds like this. But I was like, well, I can't really take that on stage, so this is basically this instrument here through effects. So that's what I've sampled. And then I also have sort of some sample bass just literally triggering in Ableton. So I've got some like pad noises here. If I turn my channel up. And I can add that. So that tends to be how I layer my stuff very simply. It's just audio effects, sampled keys, and then also sample audio triggers. So if we double click there, you'll just see, I think that's just like I've also got talking samples as well. And this is what I tend to do more with a MIDI foot switch. I just don't have it with me, guys, because I don't live in England now. But I can do this all in my hands and my keys. So basically my MIDI keyboard plays melody, rhythms, audio effects, playing different sample keys, different clips and audio effects. And I can put this all through my pedalboard while playing guitar and while playing in keys and loop it. That's my main setup.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm gonna do something possibly a bit silly now. We'll see if it works. Yes, it did. Okay. Oh, no, it didn't. Okay, one sec. There we go. All right. So, hi. That was great. Thank you. I'm hoping that I'm actually in the frame of the camera. But okay, so some questions. Number one, there was a lot of positive comments on the stream that were basically just saying things like, this is really cool. And really inspiring. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. Can I just ask, firstly, earlier on, you used a band name generator, which was, you put in a name of a band and it kicked out a load of bands that were similar. Yes. What was the name of that generator again?
It's called Every Noise.
Every Noise.
And it's connected to Spotify. So it's quite good if you're sort of interested in, trying to sort of orientate yourself, or you hear of one band and you want to listen to 20 others. But all the genre, and it has every genre that you can think of in the world. So from like, I don't know, sort of... So they just mapped out all the genres that exist. Yeah.
Amazing. All the genres that exist.
All that they exist.
All of them.
Yes, exactly.
That's fantastic. Okay, so you mentioned earlier that the idea of people being fatigued by laptop performances. Do you feel like that is a vibe, like that guitars and other live instruments are kind of making a comeback?
I think so. When I spoke to some of these artists, they were talking about the change, especially in the last 10 years, of festival lineups. And that maybe sometimes some of the festivals, like, I don't know, so I went recently to like All Points East, or where you might actually only have like a percentage that are band orientated and the rest might be like Ableton live setups, or different sort of formations of what we think is live and live performance. But I think, I just think, I don't know if, this is what I keep questioning myself. Would it be even better to just play the stuff out of really great like club oriented speakers and just be controlled of the sound, or is there a way that we can have that sort of club and electronic music production in our instruments and make it much more fun for people to play with each other? And so I don't know if the band, I can't, like, I'm still trying to find it myself, whether it's sort of like, actually the best way to do it is almost like press play on a controlled format of a laptop and just let people and let the audience respond to it, or whether it's more satisfying as a musician to sort of have that control yourself.
So this is what you're talking about when you refer to the third space
at
the top of the session. And do you think that there's like how would you encourage guitarists and instrumental players to proceed with mapping out their own third thing or third space?
This is like, taken me a lot of time, and it's I think for me personally, even if it's a weird setup you're playing on stage, is to just try and get out and play with your weird third space thing in the real space as soon as you can. So you start off, maybe I'll just do some like an Ableton push performance, but then I'll put some like live effect, just pedal effects, so I'll have a reverb through it, and then you keep adding to that and then make it part of your sound. So then that's what I would suggest, is almost it's a fear-based driven stuff that if you're worried about it doesn't sound as good live anyway, it's a good process to go through to sort of think about the recovery and what works in spaces, and it would actually enhance your production. So if you're sort of like a studio-based person, I think it sort of helps with that feedback loop to yourself.
So which ties into what you were saying, that it's not just about your playing, it's about responding to every room you're in and the frequencies, but also the people in them and how they're responding to the music, I assume. So okay, cool. Where do you think people should start if they're interested in blending their live pedal performance or whatever with their DAW?
I think sort of a lot of sound cards, you might want multiple outs. So like an artist like Blink Beats, he has multiple ins and outs. So you might have a sound card that has 8 ins and outs. But to start with, like, I've got it pretty stripped here, just two outs. So I've tried to do it as simplistically as I could, like not thinking I have to take a whole sort of massive rack sound card with multiple ins and outs. You can just start with literally like it's just 2 in, 2 out, and just trying to be quite simplistic. So I just have the guitar coming in and out, and then I just have Ableton in and out, and that's my sort of...
And that's it.
That's it. So but I was like really inspired by Blink Beats and looping multiple channels and having that all done simultaneously. But for me, if you're just starting out, maybe that's a good way to start, is sort of not to think... Because when we think of the studio, we think of 16 tracks, 24 tracks, this sort of stuff, and you're sort of thinking, well, that's quite logistic difficult, but you could just start with a couple of channels if you're just trying to loop your vocals, and then using a push and sort of that sort of thing, and just having this sort of rig for vocals. Or literally if you're a drummer and you just want to have a minute play snare for a gig, you could have a small rig like this, or probably a sound engineer's nightmare, but you could you could turn up and do that. So so
okay.
I think and all that sort of character driven, like it might just be a manipulation of a snare sound, let's say, gives you that sort of sonic signature and that people remember.
Absolutely. Okay, JB, can I just check, has anything popped up on the stream? Nothing at the moment. Okay, cool. Well, in that case, I think we're almost bang on like 8 o'clock, so I feel like actually it's probably a good place to leave it. If folks have additional questions on the stream, then head over to the We Move channel on the Music Hackspace Discord, and we'll collect them from there. And get them to Laura Lee, who's done such a spectacular job this evening. So thank you so much.
It's all right.
It's been fabulous. I'd also like to point out that there is There's like a label on this that says Pedalboard of Fun, which is fantastic. But yeah, thank you so much. Folks, thank you so much for showing up to this We Move session. We will have another one next week with Leah Mice, who is going to be doing a session on large-scale digital instruments. If you want to sign up for an IRL ticket, you can head over to musichackspace.org and check out our What's On section. It will be a really interesting presentation, and we'll be holding it at University Arts London's Creative Computing Institute. Yes, there we go. I got the abbreviations right. So yeah, so thank you so much everyone for coming along. Thank you to all our sponsors for tonight. It's been phenomenal, and thank you very much to Laurie.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.